quality control test, Katana Superlight. So one thing that's not really relevant, but people will notice, is if you squeeze the bottom, you can get the side buttons to click, but you can push on the top as hard as you want. That never happens. That was the left mouse button that I hit with my knuckle. So yeah, not actually a problem. You can feel a small amount of side flex. See if the buttons move when I do it. But it doesn't, again, doesn't easily actuate any thumb buttons. Let's see, I'm getting a little bit of creak from right here when I try to squeeze aggressively with my pinky. Okay, but normally when I use this mouse I don't end up leaving my pinky right there, so I haven't actually noticed that until just now. So yeah, there's a little bit there. If I were to ever take this apart, that would just be, you'd put a little bit of like that fabric band-aid material I like using. Just throw a little bit of that in there to fill up that space, and that'll stop. So that's not really a design fault as much as it is just a quality control issue on this particular copy. That may not show up on other katanas, because that doesn't show up anywhere else around the shell the same way. Let's see, what else? Oh yeah, so the one complaint, other than the buttons being a little bit, they have a good amount of pre-travel there. If you swap those out for, like, excuse me, GM4s, you could probably fix that, but I don't know for sure because I haven't tried it. The reason I say, like, Kale switches, specifically GM4s, GM8s, is they have less, because this isn't loose rattle. This is like actual motion in the button plunger prior to the click happening. And a lot of switches, like TTC Gold Dustproofs, do this. So do most Huano switches. They have more motion here. They're like the same as Chinese arm rods, basically. They all have a similar amount of motion prior to the actual click happening, whereas the Kales have noticeably less than like every other brand. So the GM4s and the GM8s, because they're so crisp and have less kind of take up prior to the click point, would help with that most likely. The main buttons do use Huano Blue Shell Pink Dots, which are kind of like a GM4 competitor. Very crisp. Basically zero pre-travel. And the clicks feel nice and tactile, but they're not overly heavy, and there is no upwards rattle from the switches. If you get a fingernail under there, you can force it to pick up slightly, but just playing, you don't get rattle off the switches the way that you do off of something like a Corsair Saber Pro, where like my finger is tacking to the button and making that rattle when I pick it up off there, because it's lifting the button and then it's flopping back down. Anyway, so this doesn't do that, but what it does do is there's a little bit of side play in the buttons, and just that first fraction of a millimeter of play is pretty easy to make happen with a small amount of force. So when you're using the mouse and you're trying to aim left or right, sometimes you feel the buttons shift slightly under your fingers, and it's a little bit disconcerting. I think you could do something about that. I'm not sure exactly what it would be required to fix it, because I haven't opened this guy up yet, but that is one thing to note. The scroll wheel has a tiny amount of ability to rattle if you actually grab it and force it, but you can't feel that during normal use. It doesn't wobble around in its housing or anything, and the steps are consistent, nice and tactile. And the click is a good level of crispness, tactility. It's not too heavy. Yeah, I like Ninjutso scroll wheels. I've never had an issue with any of them. I've never seen these guys double click, either the Origin 1X or anything with the GM8s or this one. But I haven't owned a single copy of a Ninjutso mouse for a horribly long time either. But I've not seen any, I can't recall seeing any reports of them double clicking on mouse review. Yeah. So mainly just on my particular copy, there's that little rattle there, or not rattle, but a squeak. That's just from a slight gap between the upper and lower halves of the shell right there. And again, that would be entirely fixable. But my usual grip with the mouse is to do more of this kind of thing where I'm primarily squeezing with my ring finger and my thumb, and then pushing the mouse into my pinky knuckle here. So there's kind of a triangle of support. And so I'm not putting, and my pinky kind of ends up going up here, whereas the squeaky point is there. So it doesn't overlap with that area and doesn't create that sound while I'm playing with it. But yeah, I mean, overall, so I've gone through and pointed out a lot of things that you could find fault with in this mouse, but generally speaking, compared to everything else I can think of that's a similar price, especially for the weight, this feels more solid and kind of just better screwed together, and there's less rattles or squeaks in it during normal use than almost any other sub $100 mouse I can think of. In fact, most of the over $100 mice I can think of too, because I don't think a GPX would be this well screwed together out of the box, and I've never tried a Final Mouse product. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on it. What else? Anything? Oh, well, if you were trying to figure out what could Ninjutso do differently to fix this issue with the side rattle here, the best example I have of a mouse that doesn't have that issue is Vaxi's stuff. And what they do is they use a thicker piece of plastic back here to mount these buttons into the shell. And then they use less plastic around the button itself. So a lot of mice, the Xenix Titan G Air is a good example of this. You can feel that there's other plastic structures around the button stopping it from wobbling as far as it naturally would be able to. Whereas the Zowie, or not the Zowie, the Vaxi mice, it can wobble if you force it. There's a lot of space around the button. But because it's mounted in place well and it doesn't deform with a tiny amount of force the way that these can shift left or right easily, then what you get is, because there's nothing around the switch that's interfering with it or that it's bumping up against, you don't get, like the Xenix, sometimes you get this feeling that the button is kind of just barely rubbing against something, and the sound kind of reflects that. But with the Vaxi mice, you don't really run into that same feeling. I don't know. If I were trying to describe it, I would say it's like a slightly clearer click feel. If you go to the end of my fixing click feel on this mouse video that I just put up yesterday, and go to the end where I talk about lubing the scroll wheel and how it gets rid of sort of tactile noise in the scroll wheel actuation and helps you identify the steps more easily because there's less non-important tactile feedback. It's like that. The Vaxi mice have virtually zero unimportant tactile feedback in the clicks. And so that's, I think, why people like them so much. So yeah, if Ninjutso reinforced the mounting for the buttons in the shell and then gave a bit more space around the plungers at the front end, I think they could improve the click feel even further and get rid of this slight tendency to shift sideways.